That to load, and then we'll make sure that it's all working. Maybe. Maybe. Right, that looks right. And we're good. All right. That and that and back there. Okay. All right. Only takes 400 clicks to get the class going, but some things are worth doing in order to make sure we can be able to review and study again, even for those that can't make it at 12 o'clock. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining me as we pick up with Bechukotai on chapter 26 of the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. Now, normally Bahar and Bechukotai are a double header, that is to say, a double parshiot. But when we have certain calendar, well, not irregularities, but uncommon situations, then they get spread up a little bit and we end up with them separated. But that does give us a little bit more time to investigate each of them in more depth. And last week we talked about the concept of slavery, very difficult and just scratching the surface, of course. Today we're going to look in Bechukotai and well, what it starts off with and the concept of both the blessing and curse that comes, and what that actually means as far as our motivation, our connection to Torah as a whole. After all, chapter 26 here, starting with verse 3, is setting itself up with this conditional phrasing, im bechukotai, if within my statutes, my laws, you will walk. And then, of course, we're going to get the obverse of if you don't follow the commandments, etc., etc. This seems to be an attempt at persuasive text, that it is trying to convince the reader of something. What exactly we're trying to be convinced of and what the true methodology of the convincing is meant to be is, I believe, a little bit deeper and more subtle than the average reading might give it. So let's go ahead and dive in, see the text, and then we'll take a look at our commentary as usual. So, as I mentioned, chapter 26, verse 3. If by my laws you walk, and my commands you keep and observe them. So we have these sort of three part here. One thing to bear in mind is that some of the different translations will often use synonyms and sometimes identical translations for different words. So let's just make sure that we can see some of the basic text that we're using here. So a chok, as in uchukotai, those are here being translated as laws. Some people will translate those as statutes. We'll come back to what those mean in context when we get to our commentary in more depth. Mitzvot, that is almost clearly translated as commandment. And the idea here is that, of course, we are keeping them and doing them, which again is a little bit redundant, and redundancies matter, as we will come back to. So tishmeru shomer is the word usually used for guarding or to keep something in a protective sense. And of course, vasitem is from the word oseh, meaning to do them. So that I think it can easily be seen why we get to observe. All right. So if you keep them and you observe them, then I will give forth your rains in their set time, so that the earth gives forth its yield and the trees of the field give forth their fruit. Threshing will overtake vintage for you, and vintage will overtake sowing. This is saying that the bounty of each harvest season will be so great that you won't even finish harvesting one before the new things come in, meaning there's no gap in the flow of a bounty. That's a very good thing if you're a farmer. You shall eat your food and be satisfied, and be settled in security in your land, something that would be a beautiful thing. I will give peace throughout the land, so that you will lie down, and none will to make you tremble. Excuse me. I will cause to cease wild beasts from the land, and a sword shall not cross through your land. You shall pursue your enemies, and they will fall before you to the sword. 5 of you will pursue 100, and 100 of you a myriad pursue, and your enemies will fall before you to the sword. So the idea here is that should Israel be attacked, or should it be under threat, that Israel will be able to defeat even much larger foes when they are in this beautiful time. Onward, I will turn my face toward you and make you fruitful and make you many, and I will establish my covenant with you. You will eat old grain, the oldest stored, and the old for the new you will have to clear out. So there's going to be so much in your stockpile that you'll be eating the older stuff, which is considered to be like the what you would normally touch like last. It would be so much built up that you're constantly just eating the end of the grain that you grew many, many seasons ago, rather than the grain that you grew just now. I know that sounds weird, but you have to think of it as having a full pantry. Imagine you have 100 cans of soup that you have bought over the years. You're going to always be eating the oldest soup that you bought because you don't want it to expire. And the new soup will constantly be being added, which is forcing you to eat the old stuff because you'll leave the new stuff for later, just in case you don't get any more new for a while, but that's not what's going to happen. You will constantly be eating from the oldest because there will always be new to replace it. And that means that you'll, in fact, sometimes have to even throw away food because there'll be so much new grain that you won't have room to store the oldest of the grain. Again, if we were all farmers, we'd understand this beautifully. I will place my dwelling in your midst, and I will not repel you. I will walk about in your midst, and I will be a God for you, and you yourselves will be a people for me. I, Adonai, am your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt, from your being serfs or slaves to them. I broke the bars of your yoke, enabling you to walk upright. All right, so that is the general discussion of the blessings, and as you can see, it is coming with not only signs of prosperity, excuse me, but also signs of spiritual intimacy, of our connection with God. So these blessings are indeed ones that are beautiful and inspiring, but they are very, well, let's say, generalized. There's not a lot of specificity here. Oh, a few things like the vintage overtaking the threshing and comments like that, yes, but by and large, it's not in the absolute particulars. It's not down into the weeds, if you can have weeds among the blessings. Now, that's not so surprising until we see that for the rest of chapter 26, the remaining 30-some verses, we are going to get a lot of specificity about what we call the curses. So that is a very interesting contrast that we will need to at least mention when we get to our commentary. But let's take a look at how this begins. And if you do not hearken to me and do not observe all these commandments. All right, so here we get the other hand, the im lo. We began with the im, right? If you do, and now we go to the im lo, and if not, meaning and if you don't do. Now, there are a couple things to notice right away, which we'll spend more time on in our commentary. One of them is if you flick back, and pages are better for this than scrolling, I'm afraid. Verse 3, there we are. Bechukotai, right? If you walk in my ways and my commandments you keep, you guard, and you do them. All right, hold that in mind. Flip back down to our verse here. And if you, we should be looking for, if you don't walk in my ways, that would be the immediate corollary. If you walk in my ways, if you don't walk in my ways. But instead, we get a different word than we'd had in any of the preceding introduction to the blessings. Here we get the phrase tishmeu. Now, tishmeu, hopefully you can recognize, if you cut off the prefix and the suffix, it comes from that lovely root shin mem aim, which is, of course, the root for Shema. Here, hearken, which thankfully in English does have a very similar field of meaning as the Hebrew does, because you can hear somebody And that is how Fox is translating it here. Hearken meaning to obey. So if you obey me or obey to me, again, we'll come back to that. And or rather, if you don't do that, and you don't do all of the commandments, all of these commandments, well, we would expect to then get into the curses, because that was more what happened in our beginning verses. But instead, we get an additional list of if we don'ts. Instead, we get if my laws you spurn, here's Bechukotai, but we have a different verb going with it. Rather than don't walk, it is instead reject or spurn. And if my regulations or laws, my mishpatai, word that was not included at the beginning, oftentimes mishpat is used for the type of Torah legislation that seems more rationally based, laws regarding theft, personal injury, murder, those sorts of things. If my regulations you repel by not observing all my commandments, by your violating my commandment. All right, so now we've got a whole list of potential violations, and we're going to have to unwrap those in our commentary. But what happens if that happens? I, in turn, will do this to you. Right? It is conditional. I will mete out shock to you and consumption and fever, types of illnesses, wearing out the eyes and exhausting the breath, and you will sow your seed for naught, for no purpose. For your enemies will eat it. Rather than you eating the year after year stored up grain from all of the bounty, you will instead not even get to eat what you grow that year, because someone else will displace you and take it from you. And I will set my face against you, as opposed to turning my face towards you. You will be hit by plague in the face of your enemies. Those who hate you will dominate you. You will flee with no one pursuing you. Now, if after all that you do not hearken to me, I will continue to discipline you sevenfold for your sins. I will break your fierce pride. I will give your heavens to be like iron and your earth like bronze, meaning that the ground will be hard and the sky will not rain, so that your power will be spent for naught. Your land will not give forth its yield. You may plow, but nothing's going to grow in that earth and with that type of weather. The trees of the land will not give forth their fruit. Now, if you walk with me in opposition and do not consent to hearken to me, I will continue against your blows sevenfold according to your sins. All right, we're going to pause there because it goes on, like I said, for another 20 verses or so. But I want you to notice already the pattern, which is to say that when we began with the blessings, yes, it was only a few verses and they were fairly general, and we're getting a little bit more specificity here, and it continues to increase as we go through the next few verses, or 20 verses. But you'll also notice that as we go through these curses, that it is actually a building on each level. That we began with, if you do not hearken to me, and then we get this, you will have disease and you'll run from your enemies. And then in verse 19, we get another, and if you still don't listen to me, then there will be more discipline. And then again in verse 21, and if you still don't walk in my ways, then this is what's going to happen. So over and over again, there is a pattern of escalation that was not present in the statement of the blessings. It didn't say, if you follow my commandments, then you're going to get A. And if you follow my commandments in some new way, you're going to get A plus 1 or B. It just said, if you follow, here's a list. But for the curses, we're getting a staggered level of discipline as we continue, despite the negative impact of our disobedience. If we continue to embrace the wrong path, then there will continue to be an increase, an escalation of the disciplinary actions. And that is something that has to give us a little bit of pause. I mentioned at the beginning that this whole section of text, all of chapter 26 really, is a very clear attempt at a persuasive text, that Moses has not brought this on God's behalf just to tell us two conditional phrases, but instead to help us choose between these conditional phrases. Now, on the surface, it might seem that this is a classic carrot and stick type of model, that if you do what's right, then good things are going to happen. And if you do what's bad, then bad things are going to happen. Therefore, do good. It could be read that way. Indeed, there's nothing wrong with reading it in that way. But it's not entirely a clear motivation. That is to say, how exactly am I going to be held responsible? Am I held responsible only when I don't hearken? Am I held responsible when I don't do all of these mitzvot? What defines all? Are these horrible curses going to fall upon me when I accidentally break Shabbat inadvertently? Or is this going to fall upon me when I mislabeled something in my store and overcharged a customer? Is this going to fall upon me if I steal, a dime's worth of food from the vendor at the farmer's market? What exactly is the threshold here? Because if we're talking about persuasive speech, then we have to have a fundamental target of behavior. We can't just say, don't break the commandments or else all this will happen, unless that's what we actually mean. And I will posit that by every reading of history, as well as every reading of rest of Tanakh, that God does not simply punish us immediately and irrevocably in an escalating fashion for every single commandment that might be transgressed. That there is something, deeper going on here. If this was a straightforward, if you do A, you're getting lightning bolted, or take your pick of the curses in this list, then we would see this happening constantly, because as we are reminded in our daily tefillah, as well as on Yom Kippur in exemplary fashion, all of us commit transgressions throughout, our lives. And yet we generally are not constantly receiving anything like the scale of curses that are being described here. So that leads us to search for a deeper warning that is happening here, and a deeper invitation as well. As we also know, that simply doing a couple mitzvot doesn't unveil all of the blessings that were mentioned in the first part of this chapter. So there must be something else more foundational and more incremental, more building involved in all of this. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at that. One other thing I do want to also point out, which often gets lost in translations to English, because English does have a limited expression on its pronouns, something that we talked about a few weeks ago. And that is that these statements are put into the second person plural in the Hebrew. Now, in English, the second person singular is you, and in English, the second person singular is you, and the second person plural in English is also you. You can say the word you if you are talking to one person, and you can say the word you if you are talking to 1,000. Hebrew is not the same. In Hebrew, there is one form of the verb and pronoun when you are speaking to an individual, and there is one form of the pronoun if you are speaking to a group. And then there are some gender issues as well, but let's leave it at that for the moment. So this whole section is put into the plural form. So we could argue, and indeed some have, that this is a blessing and a curse that is not being offered to an individual as a carrot and stick, but is instead being offered as a communal effect. That when the community has reached a level that is somewhat appropriate, we're not sure what it is, to meet the criteria of the blessings, then the community will be blessed. And if the community reaches a level of inappropriateness, as mentioned in the curses, then that's what they will get as well. It is a little bit trickier, though, because then how do we realize what threshold are we dealing with? All right, so hopefully you recognize this is a little bit more complicated than just a simple carrot and stick kind of situation. This is not just God standing as the nanny in the nursery saying, if you clean up the room, you're going to have candy, and if you leave it a mess, you'll go to bed without supper. It simply does not work, both linguistically as well as historically, and certainly not theologically in any way, shape, or form like that. So what actually is going on? Well, we're going to pop into our discussion on the commentaries. Let me just check back. Nothing on the YouTube. And let's take a look at some of the commentaries. First, I've just brought a fun idea here with Ibn Ezra, because he often has a blunt way of speaking to the reader or about other people, and it's important to remind ourselves of the necessity of speaking clearly sometimes. The empty heads say that there are more curses than blessings. Well, I mean, come on. There's like half a dozen verses of blessing, and then there's about 30 verses of curses. That seems more, one seems more than the other. However, they do not speak the truth. It doesn't mean that they're lying. When a commentator says they don't speak the truth, oftentimes what it simply means is the statement they have made does not reflect reality. It is not true. Not that it's a lie, but it simply is incorrect. And that's, one of those limitations of language again. What Scripture does is to speak of the blessings in general terms. However, it lists the curses in details in order to frighten and scare the listeners. What I say will be clear to one who reads the text carefully. So what Ibn Ezra is getting at here is that we could take this indeed as a carrot and stick, but we have to understand human psychology, that enumerating all of the different aspects of the blessings would have a diminishing return on inspiring good behavior. That speaking of them in general terms is enough to let people know that those blessings are there. If you were to sit down and look at it carefully, you would actually notice that each of the curses is found as the opposite of the blessings that are there. It's just the blessings speak in broad terms, whereas the curses sort of spell out what the opposite looks like in more detail. And why? Because humanity has a negativity bias. We tend to gravitate in our mind and to overweigh the danger of things or the importance of things that are negative than things that are positive. And if we are trying to convince people to keep the commandments in a general way, then a little bit of mentioning of the blessings will be useful, more, not so much, but every detail on the curses is going to be carried and weighed more seriously by the average human, who tends to value things that are scary more than things that are nice. It's a strange quirk of human nature. Look up negativity bias. It's just kind of how we are programmed, and the Torah seems to be taking advantage of it. But that doesn't mean that there are more curses. It just means that there was a reason for detailing the curses that was not there for detailing the blessings. Okay. Now, coming back to our original question of, well, what is the threshold that we are dealing with when it comes to these different blessings? Well, Chizkuni wants to help us with a little bit of language. All these commandments, as we saw, the phrase was kol, right? All of these commandments. If you fail to observe any of these commandments. Wait a minute, hold on. Those are two different words, aren't they? Well, in English, yes. But, says Chizkuni, in this phrase where it says kol hamitzvot, we can't take it to mean all of the commandments, meaning that one must violate all of them, because otherwise someone could say, I am going to always shoo away the mother bird before taking an egg, but I will break every other commandment. And at that point, God can't do anything to me because I haven't broken all of them. Typical, small child contrarianism of trying to find a loophole in the parents' instructions. No, says Chizkuni, in fact, this phrase is not saying that these curses would only kick in if you violate all of the commandments. Instead, what it actually means is any of the commandments. But is that so? Can the language really support that reading? Well, he explains. We find parallel construction in Exodus 20:10, where it uses the phrase kol melacha with regards to Shabbat, that on Shabbat we should not do all work. Well, if we read it as all work, then it would be nonsensical, because how would I ever be able to violate Shabbat? I can't do an infinite amount of work. I can't do every kind of work on one day. So that means I'll never violate Shabbat as long as there's some work I don't do? No. Clearly in context, the grammar of the language is trying to say any work, that anything that counts as work or all things that are counted as work, you should not do. And that would be a more logical and linguistically accurate way of reading this. Likewise, in Exodus 22:21, kol amana ve'yatom, you are not to mistreat any widow or orphan. If we were to translate that as you will not mistreat all widows or orphans, then that would mean as long as one widow and orphan went unabused, that I was okay to terrorize all the others, which clearly is not what the commandment is trying to say. So, as our threshold, we should see that it makes sense to say that we are not talking about violating all the commandments. We're talking about violating any of the commandments. But that does seem to put us back into the quandary that now, if I am responsible, or at the very least, we are responsible for any of the commandments, then doesn't that mean the curse is going to kick into effect all the time? Because there's no way that we can constantly avoid any violation by any members of the community. That the entirety of the Torah is built around the idea that we will make mistakes and that there will be paths to remedy them. After all, that's a large portion of the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, is dealing with sacrifices made when there has been a cheta or an avera, when there's been sins. And of course, when we read Acharei Mot, we talked about the whole Yom Kippur service in detail. So, yeah, I get the language. It makes sense the way that Hiskuni is explaining how we should read these verses, but it does seem to put us into a different position of difficulty. Okay, so maybe there is another way to read this than just, if you make one mistake, it's all going to go, terrible. Maybe there's a different way to read this, and maybe there are special types of mistakes, or indeed a particular hierarchy. Turning to Rashi, who is often our friend for clarifying things nicely, and more importantly, opening the door to other comments and other explanations, which are even more deep in their analysis. But if you will not hearken unto me, right? So that is our opening phrase of the curses. What is it actually we are expected to hearken to in this place? To study the Torah laboriously in order to fathom the textual interpretation of the sages. Okay. What is Rashi trying to say? Rashi is trying to say that our introductory phrase, which, if you remember, I pointed out Tishmeu was different than our introductory phrase of the blessings, that is hearkening not generically to God, not generically to the mitzvot, but specifically that we are engaging in Torah study. And not just casual Torah study, but, well, the kind of Torah study that we're doing at the moment, which is to say, pursuing rigorously the act of trying to unpack the implications of all of the commandments, not just allowing ourselves to coast, if you will, on our superficial understanding, or, well, that's what, my second grade Hebrew school teacher told me, but to continue to pursue more depth and understanding. Okay, well, but that seems a little bit odd, because if I am being told that all of these curses are contingent upon my diligent study, that doesn't seem to mesh with the idea that it's actually about fulfilling the commandments. What do I do with that? Well, as we can see, this will be unpacked. I will do this unto you, meaning the various curses. Now, one might think that this refers to the fulfillment of the commandments, like Hiskuni kind of hinted. When, however, Scripture states immediately afterwards, and you will not do all my commandments, it is evident that the fulfillment of the commandments is mentioned there. So Rashi is pointing out that we do actually get mention of the commandments, ta'asu et kol ha-mitzvot, right? So if this is about doing all the commandments, like Hiskuni mentioned, then the first half of the phrase must be about something else. It can't just be about doing the commandments, because that's already covered. And that means we need a different understanding, that we need to figure out what it is that God is going to do, what it is we're going to do that will trigger verse 16 that God does for us, God does against us. And according to Rashi, that is found within that Tishmeu. That is our key word. That is the one that stands out as being incongruous and thus demanding of more explanation. And if anything is ever seemingly redundant or unnecessary within a verse, chances are it is the linchpin to the actual meaning of the verse, at least the linchpin of the deeper meaning than the other words, which seem more obviously self-evident that they should be there. Now, we have another word that indeed fits into that category of seemingly superfluous. What is the force of the word li, right? That you will hearken li, which usually might just be translated as to me. It implies that your disobedience is directed against me. The word li is used only in the case of such a one who knows his master and yet of set purpose rebels against him. That is to say, the entire chapter containing these threats of punishment is addressed only to such a person, not to one who sins against God unwittingly. Again, let's take a look at that verse so I can point it out in context. What Rashi is bringing here from the classical Midrashim is the idea that this verse could have very easily just been written, V'im lo tishma'u, right? And if you do not hearken, right? Meaning if you do not obey. But by specifically mentioning what could have been an implied pronoun target, li, we are being told that this is going to limit everything from verse 14 through the end of the chapter to people that are deliberately not hearkening to God. This is not somebody who commits a sin because of accident or even because of other motivation. This is somebody that has decided that they are going to reject God, and as such, they are now free to commit whatever transgression they are in the midst of committing. That is a very different standard than just oops, or even the kind of things where we might naturally, stumble, but then pick ourselves up afterwards. You're walking down the street and you see somebody's lost animal and you just can't be bothered. You don't have time to take care of this right now. And that's not because you are rebelling against God per se. You're not saying, haha, God wants me to return the animal, but I will stand against such nonsense. Instead, it's for other motivation that you are choosing not to engage in the mitzvah. That is not what's covered by chapter 26. Chapter 26 is specifically building off this li. I know it's a lot to hang on a tiny little word, but it is building off this notion of rebellion, that somebody has rejected God per se, that the disobedience is directed, not merely occurring. And how do we know that that's the type of term that it can mean? Well, we see similar usage in other passages. For example, in reference to Nimrod in Genesis 10, a mighty hunter before Lifnei, coming from the same style of word, the Lord, which means he knew him, meaning that Nimrod was aware of God and yet of set purpose rebelled against him, but chose deliberately not to follow God, to spurn what God wanted. Similarly, in reference to the men of Sodom, but the men of Sodom were evil and sinful against the Lord, Ladonai, there it is the third person. So they did this exceedingly. They knew their master, meaning they recognized that God existed, and yet of set purpose rebelled against him. That is the context then for all of the rest of the curses. So that means there's something very integral to this notion of study and this notion of rebellion that is found in our verse. One more Rashi that's parallel to this, and then we're going to take a deep dive into this notion. So, and you will not do, right? The second half of the verse, because you will not learn, you will not practice the commandments. Thus, you have two separate sins mentioned here. So, Rashi is trying to explain to us why, if the first half is talking about the fundamental problem that all these curses are tied to, a rejection of God, a rebellion of God, a refusal to listen to the commandments as they are godly, meaning that you're rejecting God, then why bring the second half, right? Because now that the first half is doing the heavy lifting, what is the second half bringing? Well, the second half is bringing the fact that by both not connecting to God and by not committing, by not doing the commandments, we are in fact doing two different transgressions. And that means that yes, it is possible for someone to reject God in their heart, to say, I don't believe in God and yada, 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 but still keep the commandments, still even study. There are people out there that are atheists within a committed Jewish community or family that nonetheless still keep the commandments, which Judaism does consider to be better than somebody who would think that they believed in God and rejected all of the commandments. And of course, the ideal is, of course, to believe in God and to embrace the commandments. Okay, but let's take a look at how this commandedness element, this notion of study, and everything else that is happening here in this chapter leading up to the curses is in fact built into a very systemic belief system, or rather the very systemic deconstruction of a belief system. The Torah refers to the people not heeding the instruction to study Torah, like Rashi mentioned. It goes on to list a succession of 7 different sins, each progressively more serious than the preceding one. And the words, and you will not do, are a direct result of your failing to study Torah. So, like Rashi hinted, the reason you're not doing is because you didn't study. If you had studied, you'd know how to do it, and you'd be more likely to do it. However, that's not the end, because humans are more complicated creatures than that. Yes, there is a baseline of, I have rejected this, I am not going to study, and that is going to lead me into all sorts of mistakes because, that's what happens. But we don't usually just stop there. Our ignorance does not usually just lead us into error. It usually leads us to much more dire results. And that's what is being laid out here. That, okay, I didn't study, so now I'm making mistakes. But now that I'm making mistakes, the next sin is that you will despise my rules. That is to say, you will reject the rules themselves. The reason for this is that you do not know the reasons behind this legislation. So it is one thing to not study, and that will lead you to make mistakes because you didn't know any better. But then very often we'll turn around and say, you know what? The whole thing is stupid anyway. And the reason you're going to think the whole thing is stupid is because, one, you're already breaking the rules. And when someone points it out, you won't know why it makes sense that that is the rule. And so it's going to seem like nonsense to you. And that means that you are going to come to mock the whole system of halacha as a totality. So when someone comes to you and says, we need to eat matzah because this is what we did when we left Egypt, you're like, what are you talking about? That's bad. That's so silly. And you're going to end up now rejecting and even denigrating the basic idea of the mitzvot. It's not enough for most of us that we simply make mistakes. We have to justify our mistakes by saying that they're not really mistakes because the rule that I broke isn't even a real rule, not a good rule. I mean, honestly, why am I stopping at a stop sign if there's no one around? I mean, what kind of stupid rule is that? It is a self-justification mechanism. And as you can see, it's been going on for a few thousand years. But we're not done yet. Having rejected part of my laws, meaning having rejected the laws that are things like eating matzah or not wearing woolen linen or wearing tefillin, things that don't seem to have a obvious logical explanation for them, that if you don't study, you won't know the reason for them. Then having rejected those types of laws, you will also find fault with my statutes, feeling revolted by them. Your negative attitude will include both such legislation involving stealing and robbery, as well as regulations governing with whom you may have sexual intercourse. You will find such legislation burdensome, often running counter to your natural instincts, especially when people whom you believe you love are forbidden to you as marriage partners. So, it turns out that I really like my neighbor's wife, and love can't be wrong when it's this strong. Well, yes, actually, it still can be something that one should not act on. That we will nonetheless come to justify our behavior, even when more often than not, in our more rational moments, we would recognize the correctness of those basic statutes, the basic mishpatim, the basic laws that are there, like robbery and such. once we get going at tearing apart the foundation of mitzvot, of commandedness as a whole, it will become easy to also justify our violation even of those types of commandments. At a certain point, you know what? Stealing from someone else isn't so bad. I can come up with 100 excuses for why I should be allowed to steal from that guy over there. And even though it might seem logical to you, I am too clever and have no grounding. And thus, I can elevate myself to a position to completely reject those rules as well. But wait, there's more. When the Torah speaks about not to perform all my commandments in verse 15, this is not a repetition, which you might have thought it as such, but means that not only will you not observe my commandments, but you will try to prevent others from performing them. That is to say, the words mean so that they will not be performed. So the way you can read that particular part of verse 15 is not just that I'm not observing commandments, which has already been covered in verse 14, but instead is going to be you will try to make sure they are not performed. That is to say, in the passive voice, which means that you are trying to multiply the lack of performance. You will go out of your way to tell other people how stupid they are for not stealing when they can get away with it. And, you know, I think all of us at some point in our life have met somebody who said, oh, come on, what? Like the company doesn't owe you a little extra? You know, I mean, you think the boss doesn't take a little bit? You know, why don't you take X, Y, and Z from your company as well? It's not only that they are violating the commandment against stealing, that's not sufficient. They have to pull others into it as well. Because after all, if I cannot convince others to break the commandment, then that means I'm probably in the wrong. But if all of us are breaking the commandment, then the commandment must be wrong in the first place. And then following on, the words, all my commandments, mean that you have reached the stage when you deny the validity of any of my laws, that there is no commandment that is worth keeping. And remember, this is not just talking about things like keep Shabbat or keep kosher, which, yes, many people continue to reject and argue against. This is talking about things like don't murder. This accounts for the sixth of the seven sins we said are listed in the introduction to the warning of retributive action by God, the list of curses. Finally, the seventh sin is described as to breach my covenant. And that is indeed at the end of verse 15, where we talk about violating, breaching the covenant itself. What does that mean? That means you deny the essential tenets of Judaism. Now, that is a euphemism. Rabbeinu Bachya, like many writers, doesn't like to be as blunt as perhaps a modern want them to be. What he is essentially saying there is that when we will deny the essential tenets of Judaism, it means we deny either God's existence or that we deny the oneness of God and turn to a polytheistic mindset. But that at the very end, when we breach the covenant, what we are truly saying is that we are rejecting the partner in the covenant, not just the terms of the covenant, not just the terms that don't seem to make sense to us, and not just the terms that even do seem to make sense to us, but get in my way, and not just the terms which, you know, I'm now trying to get others to break. But in fact, I am actually breaching the relationship, full stop, with the other party in the covenant, meaning I am rejecting God completely. Going back to that concept as well of li, that it is truly against God that ultimately this rebellion is now taking seat, that it is not just a commission of a transgression, but that in the final stage, we are rejecting entirely the other half of the covenant, meaning God. That could be, again, a full-throated type of atheistic rejection, or a embrace of a polytheistic worldview. And that, of course, now is setting us up to degrade ourselves, degrade community, degrade everything, where the curses then become the standard result. Now, just want to pause there and just, you know, develop that theme a little bit more before we look into a very important section from Ramban. That's Nachmanides. And that is the notion that what this is trying to tell me here is that when we engage with the commandments, we are bothering with them for very deep reasons. It is not just carrot and stick. If I do right, I get a reward. If I do bad, I get punished. But that instead, the observance of the commandments is an element that binds us together, that plural second person, and it binds me to the God that I am in the covenant with, and that this is actually creating a stable shape for myself, for my society, for the world. And that a rejection of all of that is not just a I want to do what I want to do kind of attitude, but is instead a rejection of the stability of the world. That it is essentially saying that one would rather an anarchical system of the worst order, where one can kill another without any consequence because there's nothing to say that such an action is wrong. That is where Rabbeinu Bachya and our commentary has led us so far, which is going to bring us back to this question that was near the beginning. And I think the part where many people begin to stumble when it comes to their understanding and participation in the mitzvot is by failing to engage in study, by failing to actually look into the Torah with any level of depth, that a person will come to feel that the commandments have no reason, that there is no logic behind them, and as such, it is foolish to continue to try and observe them. And that is the start of indeed a very slippery slope. From a lack of information, a lack of study, we will come to feel out of our depth when approaching the commandments, which will naturally turn us into somebody that is antagonistic towards the whole commanded project, which will step by step degrade in the way that Rabbeinu Bachya outlined. Now, that means that trying to nip it in the bud of the reasons for what we're doing is rather important. So we're going to look at two comments here from Ramban and see how they fit together. Because statutes, and here he's using that as a translation for the word chukim, the whole Bechukotai, the root of our opening word. These are commandments, the reasons for which have not been revealed. The majority of the people, therefore, revealed to the majority of people, therefore fools reject them, saying, why does God desire that I should not wear this garment, which is woven with threads of linen and of blue wool? And how do we benefit from burning the red heifer and sprinkling upon us the ashes thereof? So that a lot of people, when they cannot see a reason for a mitzvah, will reject it because they can't see that reason. The ordinances, the mishpatim, however, everyone desires and everyone needs, meaning that a natural person will usually start off saying, we need rules about these things, or there can be no civilized life for any people or country without ordinances. You need laws. No one will reject the ordinance of he that smites a man so that he dies, and if a men strive together, and the laws of the ox in the pit, and the four guardians, and so on. Meaning people realize that we need rules of who's responsible for this pit. And if we didn't have them, that you would have no civilized life for anyone. However, the judgment that we execute upon those who transgress the commandments, such as one who has forbidden sexual intercourse or profanes Shabbat or does the sorcery of Ov and Yidoni, they will despise because of the necessity of keeping these commandments, which constitute a heavy yoke upon them. So there is a feeling, nonetheless, that when we actually get down to brass tacks and people get punished for certain transgressions, which we tend to justify to ourselves more, that we tend to feel more antagonistic towards being commanded at all. Indeed, many people will say, that they reject the notions of Torah and commandedness because they don't like the punishment of X, Y, and Z. Oh, what do you mean that somebody could have their head cut off for doing something? That's terrible. See, that's why I'm not religious. When what they're doing is saying, I find, in my superficial understanding, this to be problematic. But what I really am doing is looking for an excuse to not keep the commandments that I find troublesome, that I find in the way of doing what I feel like doing. And now that I have something to hang my hat on, so to speak, I can reject the whole biblical idea because of that, which means we have to come back again and again to this basic idea of, well, do we understand the reasons for doing the mitzvah? Do we understand them? Now, obviously, we can't go through every reason. I've encouraged you to do so before through the study of Torah, obviously with me, and through all the other many beautiful resources out there. But I wanted to look at one of Ramban's other most famous passages in a very abbreviated form, where he tries to tackle this notion of, for what reason do we keep commandments? And he starts off in that commandment, which is most confusing to many people, the commandment to shoo away the mother before taking the eggs from a nest. So, if a bird's nest chanced to be before you. This is also an explanatory commandment of the prohibition, you shall not kill it, meaning the mother, and its young both in one day. Because the reason for both is that we should not have a cruel heart. Or it may be that Scripture does not permit us to destroy a species altogether, although it permits slaughter for food within that group. All right, so first thing Ramban does is try to advance two reasons for a commandment, which doesn't have the explanation built into it. Yes, it explains what we need to do, and it explains the benefits that we will gain, but it doesn't explain why God commanded specifically that we shoo away the mother before taking the young. And Ramban is advancing that there are two very good reasons why this would be a commandment. One is that should we take the mother and the young at the same time, we would be creating in ourselves a spirit of cruelty. And the second, that should we take mother and young together, we would also be making ourselves callous towards the idea of destroying an entire species, which is also a very negative character trait to grow. Now, he isn't going to leave it there, though, because he wants to use this as a springboard to discuss this notion of the reasons of commandments in general, because obviously this is only discussing one particular commandment. Thus, the rabbis explained that our lack of knowledge of the reasons of the commandments of the Torah, for any of the places where we go look at it and say, I don't know why God made that a commandment, the Torah, the commandments of the Torah, is but a barrier in our minds. And the reason for the most difficult of the commandments, for example, the red heifer, which often gets mocked, has already been revealed to the sages of Israel, such as Rabbi Akiva, as mentioned in the above midrash. So it's not that there aren't reasons, it's simply that we don't know the reason, that we have to be a little bit more humble and modest in estimating our own ability to understand these things, that sometimes there are reasons, and the reasons are not accessible to us. Either they were explained to us, but we didn't quite understand it, or they were explained to us and we remember incorrectly, or we have never been in a position, because we didn't investigate very hard, to actually encounter an explanation. And, if you've never asked a question about a commandment that you found difficult, then you should not be surprised that you've never been given an explanation to a commandment that you have found difficult. Going back to Rashi's initial statement that the lo tishmeu, that the not hearkening is really about study in the first place, that it is through a lack of knowledge that we will come to reject and end up in the place of chapter 26's curses. Now, in order to convince us that it is worthwhile to do this, Ramban, after much additional explanation, brings to our attention the benefit from the commandments is not derived by the Holy One himself, exalted be he. Rather, the advantage is to man himself, to human beings, to withhold from him physical harm, meaning keeping us safe, or some evil belief, keep an evil idea out of our head, or an unseemly trait of character, like cruelty, or to recall the miracles and wonders of the Creator, blessed be he, in order to know the eternal. So the commandments all have a reason. even if we're not 100% sure what it is, we can be confident that it is either keeping us from harm or it is keeping us away from some insidious belief that will lead us to harm, or that it is keeping us free of a terrible character trait, or that it is there to recall miracles and wonders that will help lead us in our connection, our attachment to God directly. All the commandments do something like that, even if we can't see how, even if we can't see the method that it occurs, they are doing that. And that is something that we have to recognize, because why else would God have done it? Meaning, God did not create commandments for no purpose. And there would generally be two purposes then. Either God made commandments in order to benefit God, or God made commandments to benefit us. As God is perfect, any commandment that would be used to benefit God would imply, prior to our completion of that commandment, that God was deficient, that God was lacking something that the command would then add, that would be a benefit, that would be good for God, meaning God is now better after our performance of the deed. But that, of course, is illogical. Perfection cannot be improved upon, even by our, most beautiful fulfillment of commandments. Therefore, God gave the commandments to us for us. And these are the various things that could benefit us through the performance of a commandment in general terms. Each commandment might have one or more of these that is going on in it, and some of them may be hard to uncover and figure out, and certainly uncover for ourselves, but that doesn't mean the reason isn't there. There is a reason for each commandment, and the ultimate reason is it's better for us when we do it. So too, as he goes on to say, what the rabbis have stated, because he treats the ordinance of God like expression of mercy, whereas they are decrees. This means to say that it was not a matter of God's mercy extending to the bird's nest or the dam, that means the mother and its young, since his mercies do not extend so far into animal life as to prevent us from accomplishing our needs with them, or if so, he would have forbidden slaughter altogether. All right, now this is going to be perhaps controversial to some, but stick with it. What it is trying to say is, when Ramban said that the mitzvot are there, at least some of them, to prevent bad character traits, such as cruelty, we have to recognize that as being the goal, not the trait of mercy in and of itself that is happening. Meaning to say, it is not that God is merciful to the bird, because after all, God does let us eat them, which is hardly a, quote, merciful act by the usual definition within the human realm. But instead, it is because God wants to create mercy and compassion in us that will then lead us to behave mercifully and compassionately in all of our matters. It doesn't mean that we have to be vegetarian. It's a whole nother long conversation, and quite a good one. But it does mean that when we approach a commandment, we don't say, God is being merciful on the bird. We have to say, God is trying to help me learn to be a more merciful person, or at the very least, a less cruel person. That the purpose of it is not that God is showing mercy on the bird. The purpose of it is God is teaching to be not cruel to the person following the commandment. That the transformation is within us, not on the bird. Now, I know some people want to focus on the animal and the bird in this particular mitzvah, and that's fine. And that is certainly a way to help train us to be more compassionate. But we need to be careful that we are not misattributing the reason. Because if someone says, well, God told us to shoo away the mother because God wants to be kind to the birds, then some kid in the back of the room, or an adult, is going to raise his or her hand and say, but wait a minute, doesn't God let us eat them? How's that merciful? And when the teacher goes, well, that person is out the door. They have now said, you know what? This doesn't make any sense. The reason that my teacher gave me was stupid, and that means that all of the reasons for keeping the commandments are stupid. So where do I sign up for Zeus? Where do I reject God entirely, and how quickly can I go rob a bank? Obviously, that's not quite that fast, but that's the direction that you end up with. If you give a false reason, if you give a superficial reason, if you give a trite reason, if you give a reason that sounds good the first time you hear it, but doesn't stand up to scrutiny from, the slightest bit of inquiry, then in fact, you might be doing more harm than good. To simply remember that there are reasons and it's our job to try and uncover them, but just because we haven't uncovered them doesn't mean they aren't there. And just because we've thought of one reason doesn't mean we're necessarily right. That's why we need to continue to study and discuss it with others. That puts us on much firmer ground to actually be able to benefit from the commandments, to actually be good. And again, the ultimate beneficiation of these benefit from these commandments is, of course, to the people performing them, meaning you and I. Let's go ahead and finish up with Ramban since I'm already over time. But the reason for the prohibition against taking the mother with the nest or against killing the mother with its young in one day is to teach us the trait of compassion and that we should not be cruel. For cruelty proliferates in a man's soul, as it is known that butchers, those who slaughter large oxen and asses, are men of blood. Meaning that it was not uncommon in Ramban's experience to meet people that were a shochet, that were a slaughterer, to have a propensity for violence or more cruelty or less compassion than the other average members of his community. They that slaughter men are extremely cruel. So certainly in his day and age, people that were routine soldiers or executioners, or those that came to banditry, were often people with extremely callous souls. It wasn't as though they were merciless to the enemy and nice to everyone else. When you grow accustomed to acting in a certain way without constantly reviewing and double checking that what you're doing is correct and right, it tends to, pardon the expression, bleed over into other elements of our life. Now, does that mean that to be a shochet means a slaughterer has to be cruel, or to be a soldier has to be bloodthirsty? No, absolutely not. But it does mean that we shouldn't be surprised that there are numerous mitzvot, numerous rules and regulations guarding various actions, such as slaughtering an animal or going to war, that are there to train us away from allowing our character to be unnecessarily tainted by the actions that we are going through, by putting in mitzvot, and we are putting in guardrails to keep us away from that tendency. It is on this account, meaning of this cruelty, that the rabbis have said the most seemly among butchers is a partner of Amalek, meaning pretty terrible criticism there. Thus, these commandments with respect to cattle and fowl are not a result of compassion upon them, the animal per se, but they are decrees upon us to guide us and to teach us traits of good character. Because God forbid one of us should become cruel or callous, because that is bad for us. All right. We will leave that for today. Sorry for keeping you a little bit extra long. Hopefully no one's going to object too much. After all, we just got done learning that a little extra learning is really, really important. So please keep up with your studies. And as always, feel free to contact me at any time if you have additional questions, because after all, that's the way we untangle our thoughts and prevent ourselves from drifting into mistakes.